Brian Cole came home a week earlier than expected. For nearly 5 weeks, he had been hauling freight across the dry country west of town, following wagon roads that wound between sagebrush flats and low, sunburned hills. The work paid well, but every night beside the campfire, his thoughts returned to Emily and the child she carried. So when the job ended early, Brian sent no letter ahead. He wanted to surprise his wife. For the last 20 miles, he imagined Emily hearing his horse in the yard and hurrying outside to meet him. He could almost see her smile. But when Brian rode into his mother's place late that afternoon, Emily was not waiting on the porch. She was beside the wash line, bent over a heavy wooden washtub. Brian pulled his horse to a stop. Emily was 4 months pregnant. The gentle swell beneath her faded dress was visible now. Damp strands of brown hair clung to her pale face, and her sleeves were rolled above her elbows. Both hands were red from hot water and harsh soap. A basket of dirty linen still sat beside her. Margaret stood a few feet away. "There's another sheet," she said. "Finish it before supper." Emily reached down. "Emily," she froze. Then she turned. "Brian." Joy came over her face so quickly that it hurt him to see it. She took a step toward him. "You're home." Brian dismounted. 7 days early. Emily smiled. "Why didn't you tell me?" "Wanted to surprise you." His smile faded as he looked at her hands. Margaret noticed. "She's washing clothes." "Brian, women have done it while carrying children, since long before either of us was born." Emily reached for the washtub. "I only have a little left." Brian stepped forward and took the wooden handle from her. "Give it to me." "Brian, I can finish." "I said give it to me." There was no anger in his voice, only firmness. He set the tub down and gently took Emily's wet hands in his. "Go inside and rest." "I'm all right." "I know." Brian looked at the redness across her fingers. "I know you can do the work." "Emily, that doesn't mean you should have to." For several seconds, she said nothing. Then her eyes filled with tears. Brian's expression changed immediately. "Are you hurting?" Emily shook her head. "The baby." "No." She turned her face away and wiped her cheek. But Brian understood. Emily wasn't crying because she was tired. She was crying because someone had finally told her she was allowed to be tired. Brian slowly looked from his wife's hands to the unfinished laundry. Then he turned toward his mother. Margaret met his gaze without lowering her own. That night, long after Margaret had gone to bed, Brian lay awake beside Emily. The house was quiet, except for the wind brushing against the walls. A thin line of moonlight crossed the bed. Emily had said little after supper. Brian turned toward her and rested his hand gently on her belly. "Has the baby moved yet?" Emily smiled faintly. "Sometimes, just little flutters. Can I feel it?" "Probably not yet." Brian kept his hand there anyway. Emily gave a soft laugh. "You planning to wait all night, if that's what it takes?" For a while, neither spoke. Then Brian's smile disappeared. "Tell me what happens when I'm gone." Emily looked toward the ceiling. "Brian, please." She was quiet for a moment. "Your mother doesn't beat me. She doesn't starve me. It's nothing like that." "I didn't ask what she doesn't do." Emily sighed. She told him. The laundry, the floors, carrying water, cooking even when her back hurt. Margaret reminding her that pregnancy was not an illness and that Brian was working hard enough for both of them. "She says I ought to earn my keep." Brian's jaw tightened. "You're my wife. You don't earn your place in this family." "I know. Then why didn't you write me?" Emily turned toward him. "Because you were already working yourself half to death. That's no reason. You were doing it for me. For the baby." Brian pulled his hand away from her belly and looked at her. You should have told me. I didn't want you worrying from 100 miles away. Emily. She lowered her eyes. There was more. Brian waited. Finally she said, I didn't want to make you choose between your mother and your Heath. Brian stared at her. Why would you think you had to? Emily's answer was simple. Because she's your mother. Nothing more needed saying. Brian knew his mother's pride. He knew how fiercely Margaret held on to the people she loved, and how hard she could become toward anyone she believed might take them from her. He took Emily's hand. You listen to me. You are my wife. You're carrying our child. There shouldn't have to be a choice. The next morning, Brian told Margaret they were leaving. She argued about money, the coming winter, and the foolishness of taking a pregnant woman to a small cabin outside town. Brian let her finish. Then he said quietly, I love you, Ma. I always will. Margaret's expression softened for only a moment. But Emily is my wife. By noon, their few belongings were loaded into the wagon. Emily sat beside Brian as the house disappeared behind them. She said nothing. She simply reached across the seat, found his hand, and held it. Brian closed his fingers around hers. That morning, when Emily needed him to choose her, he had not hesitated. The cabin stood 4 miles outside town, at the end of a narrow wagon road, bordered by cottonwoods and open grassland. It wasn't much. The roof leaked over one corner when it rained. The iron stove smoked whenever the wind came from the north. Their table had belonged to another family, and the 2 chairs beside it did not match. Emily loved it from the first day. She made curtains from inexpensive cloth and placed a jar of wildflowers on the table. Brian repaired the roof, patched the door, and built shelves beside the stove. For the first time since their marriage, there was no one else beneath their roof. They were poor, but they were together. In the evenings, Emily cooked beans, potatoes, and bread, while Brian worked on a cradle beside the fire. He was not much of a carpenter. One night, Emily examined the crooked legs and smiled. Are you certain that's a cradle? Brian looked offended. What else would it be? A feed trough, perhaps. He stared at his work. That's a cruel thing to say to a man who's been working all evening. Emily laughed. Brian loved hearing that sound in their little cabin. Some nights they talked about names. Emily liked Samuel if the baby was a boy. Brian wasn't convinced. For a girl. They disagreed about nearly every name they could think of. Then one evening, as Brian knelt beside Emily's chair, with his hand resting on her belly, he suddenly stopped talking. Something had moved beneath his palm. His eyes widened. Was that? Emily smiled. The baby kicked again. Brian stared at her belly as though he had just witnessed a miracle. Well, he whispered, bending closer. There you are. Emily ran her fingers through his dazed hair. Until that moment, the child had been something they spoke about. Now, somehow, the baby felt real. Those were the happiest weeks Emily could remember. But happiness did not fill a flour barrel. By the end of the month, their small savings had begun to disappear. There would be food to buy, firewood to stack before winter, and expenses when the baby came. Then Brian was offered a freight job. The pay was better than anything he could earn nearby. There was only one problem. The trip would take nearly 3 months. Brian refused at first. Emily was 5 months pregnant. If everything went according to plan, he would return when she was about 8 months along. That still felt too close for him. That evening, they sat together beside the unfinished cradle. We need the money, Emily said. I can find something closer. Not that pays this well. Brian looked at her. I don't like leaving you. Emily took his hand and placed it over her belly. "You're not leaving us. You're doing this for us." Brian was silent for a long time. Finally, he nodded. One last long haul. Before sunrise 2 mornings later, Brian saddled his horse. He kissed Emily, then bent and kissed her belly. "I'll be home before you get here, little one." Emily smiled. "I'll be waiting." Brian rode away beneath the pale morning sky. Neither of them knew it was the last time they would part without a shadow of doubt between them. After Brian left, the cabin became painfully quiet. Emily missed the sound of his boots on the floor and the way he talked to the baby, as though the child could already understand every word. Still, she kept busy. Twice a week, she baked bread and small fruit pies, loaded them into a basket, and took the wagon into town to sell them. Brian had never asked her to earn money, but he was working for their family, and Emily wanted to do her part. One morning, while arranging pies on a table near the general store, she heard a familiar voice. "Emily." She looked up. Thomas Reed stood before her. He had courted her before Brian had. Thomas owned good horses, wore fine boots, and had once seemed certain that a woman with little money would be grateful for his attention. Emily had disappointed him. His eyes dropped to her belly, then to the pies. "So it's true through. What is, you married Brian Cole, and now you're selling pies for coins while he leaves you alone. Brian is working. So are you. By the look of it." Emily continued arranging the pies. "I'm helping my husband." Thomas smiled without warmth. "Do you ever regret choosing him?" Emily looked up. "No, not even now. Not even now." Something hardened behind Thomas's smile. "If you could choose again." Emily met his eyes. "I'd still choose Brian." Thomas said nothing. Emily picked up her empty basket and walked away. She never noticed him watching when she left town, and she never saw the horse that followed at a distance until she turned onto the road leading to her cabin. Several days passed. Then came the storm. Rain hammered the roof after dark, and thunder rolled over the open country. Emily was preparing for bed when someone pounded on the door. "Emily!" She recognized Thomas's voice. She did not open it. "Go home." "Thomas? Just let me in." "You've been drinking." Another blow struck the door. Emily slid the bolt firmly into place. "Go home." For several minutes, Thomas shouted over the rain. Then everything became quiet. Emily waited. At last she looked through the window. Thomas lay face down in the mud. She stood there, angry with him, and frightened by what might happen if she left him outside. Finally, she wrapped a shawl around herself and opened the door. Thomas was barely conscious. It took all her strength to drag him inside. She left him on the floor beside the stove, covered him with an old blanket, and placed his wet hat near the fire. Nothing more. Thomas never entered her bedroom. Emily went inside alone and locked the bedroom door behind her. By morning, the storm had passed. Emily woke to the sound of wagon wheels outside. She rose, dressed quickly, and stepped into the main room. Thomas was still asleep beside the stove. Then someone knocked. Emily opened the door. Margaret stood on the porch. Her eyes moved past Emily, straight to Thomas, and then back to her pregnant daughter-in-law. For several seconds, no one spoke. Margaret stepped inside without being invited. Her eyes settled on Thomas, still asleep beneath the old blanket beside the stove. Then she looked at Emily. "What is he doing here?" Emily closed the door behind her. "He came last night. He was drunk. In your house. I didn't let him in." Margaret's eyes narrowed. Emily continued before she could interrupt. "He stayed outside. After a while he stopped knocking. I looked through the window and found him leaning face down in the rain. I was afraid he'd die out there. Margaret glanced toward the bedroom. I brought him inside and left him by the stove. Then I went to bed and locked my door. As if the words had awakened him. Thomas stirred. He pushed himself upright and rubbed a hand over his face. Margaret turned on him. "Why did you come here?" Thomas looked first at Margaret, then at Emily. He remembered the market. He remembered Emily looking him straight in the eye and saying she would choose Brian again. He could have ended everything with the truth. Instead, "Ed," he said quietly, "you'd better ask Emily." Emily stared at him. "I already told her what happened." Thomas reached for his boots. Margaret stepped closer. "Did Emily invite you here?" Thomas paused. A faint bitterness entered his expression. "I reckon Emily knows why I came." "Thomas?" Emily's voice stopped him. "Tell her the truth." For a moment, he looked almost ashamed. Then he pulled on his boots and walked out. Margaret watched him go. When she turned back, something cold had entered her face. "I warned Brian about you." Emily stiffened. "About me? My son leaves for a few weeks, and I find another man sleeping under your roof. He was on the floor because I wouldn't let him freeze to death. So you say?" Emily placed a protective hand over her belly. Margaret's gaze followed it. Then anger spoke before good sense could stop it. "How am I supposed to know that child is even Brian's?" Emily went completely still. The words seemed to remain between them, and for one brief moment, Margaret saw another room from long ago. She was young again, carrying Brian beneath her heart, standing before her white mother-in-law, while the woman looked at her Apache face and then at her swollen belly with contempt. How could anyone be certain the child belonged to her son? Margaret remembered the shame. She remembered how deeply those words had cut. Now she had given the same wound to another woman. Regret flickered across her face, but pride buried it. Emily looked at her differently now. Not angrily, almost sadly. "Get out of my house, Margaret." Margaret left without another word. By that afternoon, she was back in town. Before sunset, an urgent letter was on its way to Brian, and with it traveled a suspicion that should never have been born. Brian had been gone less than a month when Margaret's letter reached him. He read it twice beside the freight wagon. Then he told the other men he was going home. He lost part of his pay by leaving the job unfinished. But money no longer mattered. By sunrise, he was already riding back toward Emily. 2 days later, Emily heard hoofbeats outside the cabin. She hurried to the door. When she saw Brian riding toward her, her whole face brightened. Brian, for one foolish, happy moment. She thought he had come home because he missed her. She stepped into the yard, one hand resting beneath her growing belly. But Brian dismounted without smiling. He did not embrace her. Emily's arms slowly fell to her sides. What happened? Brian looked tired. "My mother wrote me." Emily understood. "About Thomas?" "Yes." Inside the cabin, Emily told him everything. She told him about meeting Thomas in town, about the storm, about racing to let him inside, about finding him unconscious in the mud and dragging him to the stove. "I went into the bedroom afterward," she said. "I locked the door. Nothing happened." Brian wanted to believe her. Every part of him wanted to. But one question had been troubling him all the way home. How did Thomas know where we lived? Emily frowned. "I don't know. He just found this cabin 4 miles outside town." I said, "I don't know." Brian. It was the truth. But for the first time in their marriage, Brian heard the truth and wondered whether it was enough. He found Thomas that afternoon outside the livery stable. Thomas seemed almost amused to see him. "Did anything happen between you and my way?" "No." The answer came quickly. Brian stared at him. Then why were you there? Thomas shrugged. Maybe you ought to ask Emily. I did. A small smile touched Thomas's mouth. Then I suppose she told you everything. Brian's eyes narrowed. What does that mean? Thomas saw it then. The doubt, small, but alive. He knew exactly where to press. Emily never told you everything about us before she married you. Brian stepped closer. What everything? Thomas looked away. If she never told you, I don't reckon I should. There was something between you. Thomas mounted his horse. I didn't say that. And he rode away. Brian stood there watching him. Thomas had given him no proof. Not even a real accusation. Only a question. Brian carried that question home. Emily was waiting beside the unfinished cradle. One look at her husband's face told her what Thomas had done. What did he say? Brian hesitated. That there were things between you before we married, that you never told me. Emily stared at him. There was nothing. He said, I don't care what Thomas said. Her voice remained calm, but something in it stopped Brian. Emily stepped closer. I'm telling you what happened. I have told you the truth from the beginning. I know. Do you? Brian looked at her. Emily's eyes were beginning to shine. Do you believe me? He opened his mouth. Nothing came. He remembered her hands in the washtub, the month they had spent in this cabin, her laughter, the night their child first kicked beneath his palm. He remembered every reason he had to trust her. But Thomas's question remained. What if? Brian. Emily's voice was softer now. Do you believe me? He loved her. He wanted desperately to say yes, but he hesitated. Only a few seconds. Then he said the words he would spend 4 years wishing he could take back. I don't know. Emily did not cry. That made it worse. She simply looked at him, as though something inside her had gone very still. Brian reached toward her. Emily, she stepped back. Then you never knew me. Brian stood there, unable to answer. At last, confused and ashamed. He walked outside, telling himself he needed time to clear his head. Behind him, Emily remained beside the cradle. One hand rested over the child beneath her heart. The other hung empty at her side. Only a month earlier, Brian had chosen his wife without hesitation. This time, when she needed nothing from him but his trust, he had failed her. And neither of them yet knew what those few seconds would cost. Brian did not return to the cabin until after dark. He had spent hours writing without purpose, trying to silence the question Thomas had planted in his mind. But distance brought no peace, only shame. By the time Brian saw the cabin ahead, he knew what he should have known from the beginning. Emily had told him the truth. He urged his horse forward. Emily. No answer, Foy. The cabin was dark. Brian pushed open the door. Emily. The room was empty. Her coat was gone. So were a few clothes. Then he saw the letter on the table. His name was written across it. Brian opened it, with trembling hands. Brian, I could live with your mother hating me. I could live poor. I could wait for you while you worked 100 miles from home. But I cannot raise our child beside a man who may look into his face and wonder if he is truly his son. Brian stopped reading. No. He lowered himself into a chair. The letter continued. I told you the truth. I needed my word to be enough. I loved you when I had nothing. I chose you when I could have chosen an easier life, and I would have chosen you again. But when I asked whether you believed me, you said you did not know. Now I know too. I cannot stay. Brian was on his horse within minutes. What he did not know was that Emily had already gone to Ruth Carter. An an elderly midwife who lived several miles beyond town. Ruth had agreed to help her leave the territory. Emily wanted no revenge. She wanted only one thing. Her child would not grow up beneath the shadow of a question about who his father was. That night, heavy rains swelled the river. By morning, wagon tracks along the river road had been washed nearly away. Searchers found Emily's shawl, caught among branches near the muddy bank. Nothing else. Brian searched until his horse could barely walk. He followed the river for miles. He rode to neighboring settlements and questioned stage drivers, ranchers, travelers, anyone who might have seen a pregnant woman. Days became weeks. No one found Emily. No one found Ruth. And no one found a body. But the river had been high enough to carry a person many miles downstream. Eventually, even the men who had helped Brian search stopped looking. Brian did not. For weeks afterward, he would wake before daylight and ride out again. There was always another bend in the river, another road, another place he had not checked. Nothing. Nearly 3 months later, the day came when Emily's baby should have been born. Brian spent that evening alone in the cabin. The unfinished cradle still stood beside the wall. He brought it to the table and worked by lamplight. Slowly, carefully, he finished what he had begun during their happiest month. When it was done, Brian placed the cradle beside the bed. Then he sat down and looked at it. He imagined the child who should have been sleeping there. He imagined Emily beside him, but the cradle remained empty. And Brian finally understood that the words "I don't know" had lasted only a few seconds. Their cost might last the rest of his life. 4 years passed. Brian never remarried. He did not become a drunk or throw his life away. He worked, paid what he owed, helped neighbors when they needed him, and visited Margaret when age began making the harder chores difficult. But something in him had gone quiet. He and Margaret were never close again. Neither spoke often about Emily. They did not have to. One autumn morning, Brian hauled supplies to a settlement nearly 100 miles from home. After unloading flour and sugar at the general store, he stepped into a small bakery for coffee. A little boy was playing near the counter. He looked about 3.5, with dark hair falling over his forehead. Brian barely noticed him at first. Then the boy frowned while trying to fit a broken wooden wheel back onto a toy wagon. Something about that expression stopped Brian. The boy looked up. Brian felt an ache he could not explain. Then a woman's voice came from the back room. "Need help with that, sweetheart?" Brian stopped breathing. Emily stepped through the doorway. The tray in her hands nearly slipped. For several seconds, neither put. Brian. His eyes went from her to the child. The boy was the right age. "Emily," Brian swallowed. "Is he my son?" Her expression hardened. "He's my son. Please." Emily looked at him. "You had a chance to believe he was yours before he was born." Brian lowered his eyes. He had no answer. A few days later, he found Thomas. 4 years had taken some of the pride from him. Brian asked only one question. What happened that night? Thomas finally told the truth. He had followed Emily from town and learned where the cabin was. She had refused him at the door. When he collapsed outside, she dragged him in rather than let him die in the rain. "She put me beside the stove," Thomas said. Then she locked herself in her bedroom. Brian's jaw tightened. "And what were you talking about when you said there were things she never told me?" Thomas looked away. "Nothing." Brian stared at him. "Nothing. She chose you over me. I wanted you to wonder if you'd made a mistake trusting her." Brian stood silently. Thomas had planted the doubt, but Brian had allowed it to grow. When Brian returned to Emily, he told her Thomas had confessed. She showed no surprise. I never needed Thomas to tell you the truth. Brian understood. I know. He apologized without asking her to forgive him. Emily didn't. Not then. Brian found work nearby and stayed in town. At first, Emily allowed him only short visits with their son, whose name was Daniel. Brian never asked Daniel to call him father. He brought no expensive gifts and made no promise. He simply came when Emily allowed it. He carried flour into the bakery. He repaired a loose step. He stacked firewood before winter. And he spent time with his son. Weeks became months. Daniel learned to wait for Brian's visits. One afternoon, the two were sitting outside, repairing the little wooden wagon Brian had first seen in the bakery. Daniel held up a wheel. Pa, this one goes here. Brian froze. Daniel did not notice. Pa, Brian looked toward Emily. She stood in the bakery doorway. Their eyes met. Brian said nothing. He simply turned back to the boy. That's right. Hand it here. That evening, after Daniel was asleep, Brian prepared to leave. Emily followed him outside. Good night, Brian said. He started toward his horse. Brian. He stopped. Emily stood beneath the fading evening light. For a moment, neither spoke. Then she reached out her hand. Brian looked down at it. 4 years earlier, he had taken the work from those hands because he could not bear to see her suffer. Later, when she had needed something far greater from him, he had failed her. Brian did not reach for her first. He waited. Emily moved closer and slowly slipped her fingers between his. Only then did Brian close his hand around hers. Gently. There was no promise that everything was forgotten. Some wounds were too deep for that. But trust did not return in a single moment. It returned the same way Brian had learned to earn it, one day at a time. And that evening, Emily's hand remained in his. The end.